Picture a boardroom somewhere in Silicon Valley, sometime in 2013. A man has just written a very large check. We're talking tens of millions of dollars. And he's looking at a document that appears to show Pfizer has independently validated the technology he just bought into. He reads it carefully. He believes it. He goes home. What he doesn't know, what he has no way of knowing, is that Elizabeth Holmes typed that letter herself.
She didn't just lie, she signed someone else's name to it.
Elizabeth Holmes was 19 years old when she founded Theranos in 2003. She'd been enrolled at Stanford in chemical engineering for less than 2 years. She used her tuition money as seed capital. The company's pitch was extraordinarily simple. One drop of blood from a finger prick could run hundreds of diagnostic tests, accurately, quickly, and cheaply enough to democratize healthcare. It was the kind of idea that sounds like a moral imperative before it sounds like a business.
Did any credentialed voice in medicine ever actually sign off on the science? Or did she get out ahead of that question entirely by moving straight to the money?
She got out ahead of it almost immediately. When she pitched the concept to Stanford professor Phyllis Gardner early on, Gardner told her flatly that the idea wouldn't work. Multiple medical experts said the same thing over the following years. Holmes proceeded anyway. What she built instead of scientific validation was a board. And it was a board assembled not to provide oversight, but to provide credibility by association.
Henry Kissinger, 2 former secretaries of defense, George Shultz. You're essentially describing a national security roster sitting atop a blood testing startup.
That's exactly what it was. By the time the board reached its full 12-member composition, it included Kissinger, William Perry, James Mattis, who would later serve as Secretary of Defense, retired Navy Admiral Gary Ruffhead, former Senators Bill Frist and Sam Nunn, and the former CEO of Wells Fargo. These were men whose presence signaled to investors that the company had been vetted at the highest levels. Investors who might otherwise have demanded scientific proof instead looked at that letterhead and made a different calculation.
The board wasn't governing the company, it was a credential farm.
At the center of Theranos' commercial operation was a device called the Edison. The company claimed it could run comprehensive blood panels from a single finger prick sample using proprietary technology. The reality was different in almost every meaningful respect. The Edison was giving inaccurate results. Theranos knew this, and rather than fix it, they quietly ran the majority of their actual blood tests on commercially available Siemens machines, third-party equipment that any standard laboratory could have purchased. They were, in effect, a front.
So patients who thought they were getting a revolutionary diagnostic were actually getting a standard lab result dressed up in Theranos branding?
That's the commercial reality, yes. And the stakes were not abstract. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services would later find that the Newark, California lab posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety, specifically in connection with tests used to calibrate warfarin dosages, the blood-thinning medication. Get that test wrong and you're dealing with internal bleeding or clotting events. In 2016, Theranos quietly voided 2 full years of results from its Edison device.
2 years of blood tests sent to doctors used to make medical decisions.
And the company worked hard to make sure no one looked too closely while it was happening. Holmes operated, by multiple accounts, a culture built on secrecy and fear. Employees who raised concerns were fired. When then Vice President Joe Biden toured the Theranos facility, Holmes and Balwani constructed a fake lab for the visit, a staged environment designed to conceal the actual operating conditions. That detail is documented in court records. But the most audacious deception wasn't a fake lab, it was the documents.
The Pfizer letters.
Holmes admitted at trial that she personally manipulated documents, forging letters made to appear as though Pfizer and Schering-Plough had independently validated Theranos' blood testing technology. She presented these to investors as evidence of third-party scientific endorsement. Pfizer and Schering-Plough both publicly stated in October 2015 that they had no active projects with Theranos. In 2014, Holmes told investors the company was generating $100 million in revenue. The actual figure for that year was approximately $100,000. That is not a rounding error. That is a gap of 3 orders of magnitude.
At some point, you stop wondering whether she believed her own story, because the arithmetic makes belief impossible.
The story of how Theranos unraveled begins not in a courtroom or a regulatory office, but with a 20-something employee named Tyler Schultz. He had joined the company in 2013 with genuine idealism about what Theranos claimed to be doing. He also happened to be the grandson of board member George Schultz, one of the most prominent names on that 12-person roster. Tyler raised concerns internally about the accuracy of the testing. He was dismissed. He then reported the company to the New York State Department of Health, under an alias, before eventually becoming one of John Carreyrou's key sources at the Wall Street Journal.
He went around his own grandfather to blow the whistle on a company his grandfather was publicly vouching for. That's not a small thing to carry.
It wasn't. And when Theranos learned he was talking, they sent lawyers after him. Holmes had retained David Boies, one of the most feared litigators in the country, and Boies' firm threatened legal action against both the journal and against whistleblowers to suppress publication. Tyler Schultz reportedly spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal legal fees simply defending his right to tell the truth. Inside the company, the lab director Adam Rosendorf would later testify at trial that he found Theranos' instruments unsuitable for clinical use. He had raised that concern while employed there. The company's chief scientific officer, Ian Gibbons, died by suicide in 2013, an event that multiple accounts connect to the mounting stress of what he witnessed inside the organization.
A man died inside that building before any of this became public.
That is the factual record, yes. And the WSJ piece, when Carreyrou finally published it in October 2015, was met by Holmes not with correction or contrition, but with a counteroffensive. She called the journal a tabloid. That same evening on CNBC, she told Jim Cramer, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." She had just been told her fraud was about to go public. Her response was to invoke Galileo.
The defiance is almost more revealing than the fraud itself. She wasn't buying time. She still believed the performance was working.
The federal indictment came in June 2018, 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, with Holmes and her COO and former romantic partner Ramesh Sunny Balwani charged together. Both pleaded not guilty. Their cases were eventually separated into 2 trials. Holmes's trial began in August 2021, delayed more than a year by COVID-19 and her pregnancy. She testified for 7 days in her own defense. The strategy she deployed on the stand was layered and, in certain respects, remarkable.
She claimed her own experts misled her about the technology, and then separately claimed Balwani psychologically controlled her, essentially arguing she was both the visionary and the victim.
That's the architecture of it. She testified that Balwani had dominated and controlled her, what she ate, how she dressed, how much money she could spend, who she could speak with, and that he had sexually abused her during their relationship. She also disclosed that she had been raped at Stanford in 2003 and that she had sought comfort in Balwani afterward. These were serious and deeply personal claims, and the jury heard them. But Holmes also testified explicitly that Balwani did not force her to make false statements to investors, to business partners, to journalists, or to directors. She argued instead that it is not a crime to be optimistic about technology.
She personally forged those letters. That's not optimism. That's fabrication with a signature on it.
The jury agreed, at least in part. On January 3, 2022, Holmes was found guilty on 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors and 3 counts of wire fraud tied to specific investor transactions. She was acquitted on all 4 counts related to defrauding patients and doctors. The jury's reasoning on that acquittal is instructive. They felt patients were 1 step removed from the CEO, too distant in the chain of decisions to assign her direct criminal responsibility. One juror said of Holmes, "It's tough to convict somebody, especially somebody so likable with such a positive dream." The jury rated her testimony a 2 out of 4 on credibility. They still found her hard to convict.
Balwani, tried separately and without the abuse narrative, was convicted on all 12 counts.
Every single one: investor fraud, patient fraud, conspiracy. He was sentenced to 12 years and 11 months. Holmes received 11 years and 3 months, sentenced in November 2022, and reported to the federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas on May 30, 2023. Together, they were ordered to pay $452 million in restitution to victims. In February 2025, the Ninth Circuit affirmed Holmes's conviction and sentence in full. She remains incarcerated. Her projected release with good conduct credit is approximately 2032. Elizabeth Holmes personally forged letters purporting to show that Pfizer and Schering-Plough had validated Theranos' blood testing technology. She admitted this at trial. Both companies publicly stated in 2015 that no active partnership existed.
The letters weren't a junior employee's mistake that reached her desk. She made them herself.
In 2014, Holmes represented to investors that Theranos was generating $100 million in annual revenue. The actual figure, verified in court, was approximately $100,000.
That's not an overestimate, that's an invention.
Theranos voided 2 full years of Edison device test results in 2016. Results that had already been transmitted to doctors and used in patient care decisions.
We don't know how many medical decisions were made on false data. That number has never been fully accounted for.
When Vice President Biden toured the Theranos facility, Holmes and Balwani staged a fake lab to conceal actual operating conditions. This is in the court record.
They built a set for the Vice President of the United States.
Holmes's baritone-speaking voice, a distinctive part of her public persona for years, was confirmed in a 2023 New York Times interview to have been a deliberate affectation. It was not her natural voice.
She performed the character so completely that even the voice was constructed. There was almost no surface of the presentation that wasn't designed.
After the verdict, Holmes and her partner Billy Evans allegedly purchased one-way plane tickets to Mexico. The judge described the move as bold and ill-advised, but declined to characterize it as a flight attempt. Evans went to Mexico. Holmes did not.
Her lawyers said the tickets were purchased in hope of acquittal. That's a strange kind of hope that only goes in one direction.
What makes the Theranos story resistant to easy conclusions is that the fraud operated simultaneously at the level of the audacious and the mundane. Holmes raised $700 million from some of the most sophisticated private investors in the world, assembled a board that included 2 former secretaries of state and a future secretary of defense, and ran a company that was regularly featured on the covers of Fortune and Forbes. And the mechanism underneath all of it included forged letters, a fake lab, and a machine that didn't work. The New York Times called the case a symbol of Silicon Valley's culture of hustle, hype, and greed. That framing is accurate as far as it goes, but it also lets the architecture off the hook. Holmes succeeded for as long as she did, in part because the people surrounding her, investors, board members, partners, had structural incentives to believe her and almost no mechanism to verify what she was telling them. That's not an excuse. It's a condition worth naming.
The question this story can't answer, and maybe never will, is how many people along the way saw something, felt something, and chose not to follow it to the end. Not the whistleblowers, the others, the ones who stayed quiet and cashed the check.
Elizabeth Holmes is currently incarcerated at Federal Prison Camp Bryan in Texas, scheduled for release around 2032. The $452 million restitution order stands, and somewhere in a file somewhere, there is a letter with a forged signature claiming that Pfizer vouched for the future of medicine, typed, formatted, and printed by the woman who was supposed to be building it.